A religious war, or holy war, Latin, bellum sacrum, is a war primarily caused or justified by differences in religion. In the modern period, debates are common over the extent to which religious, economic, or ethnic aspects of a conflict predominate in a given war. According to the Encyclopedia of Wars, out of all 1,763 known/recorded historical conflicts, 123, or 6.98%, had religion as their primary cause. Matthew White's The Great Big Book of Horrible Things gives religion as the cause of 11 of the world's 100 deadliest atrocities. In several conflicts including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian Civil War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, religious elements are overtly present, but variously described as fundamentalism or religious extremism, depending upon the observer's sympathies. However, studies on these cases often conclude that ethnic animosities drive much of the conflicts. Some historians argue that what is termed religious wars is a largely Western dichotomy and a modern invention from the past few centuries, arguing that all wars that are classed as religious have secular, economic or political ramifications. 5 similar opinions were expressed as early as the 1760s, during the 7 Years' War, widely recognized to be religious in motivation, noting that the warring factions were not necessarily split along confessional lines as much as along secular interests. According to Jeffrey Burton Russell, numerous cases of supposed acts of religious wars such as the 30 Years' War, the French Wars of Religion, the Sri Lankan Civil War, September 11th attacks and other terrorist attacks, the Bosnian War, and the Rwandan Civil War were all primarily motivated by social, political, and economic issues rather than religion. For example, in the 30 Years' War the dominant participant on the Protestant side for much of the conflict was France, led by Cardinal Richelieu. The modern word religion comes from the Latin word religio. In the ancient and medieval world, the etymological Latin root religio was understood as an individual virtue of worship, never as doctrine, practice, or actual source of knowledge. The modern concept of religion as an abstraction which entails distinct sets of beliefs or doctrines is a recent invention in the English language, since such usage began with texts from the 17th century due to the splitting of Christendom during the Protestant Reformation and more prevalent colonization or globalization in the Age of Exploration, which involved contact with numerous foreign and indigenous cultures with non-European languages. It was in the 17th century that the concept of religion received its modern shape, despite the fact that the Bible, the Quran, and other ancient sacred texts did not have a concept of religion in the original languages, and neither did the people or the cultures in which these sacred texts were written. For example, the Greek word threskia, which was used by Greek writers such as Herodotus and Josephus, and is found in texts like the New Testament, is sometimes translated as religion. Today, however, the term was understood as worship well into the medieval period. In the Quran, the Arabic word din is often translated as religion in modern translations, but up to the mid-1600s translators expressed din as law. Even in the 1st century AD, Josephus had used the Greek term autaismos, which some translate as Judaism today, even though he used it as an ethnic term, not one linked to modern abstract concepts of religion as a set of beliefs. It was in the 19th century that the terms Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Confucianism first emerged. Throughout its long history, Japan had no concept of religion since there was no corresponding Japanese word, nor anything close to its meaning, but when American warships appeared off the coast of Japan in 1853 and forced the Japanese government to sign treaties demanding, among other things, freedom of religion, the country had to contend with this Western idea. According to the philologist Max Muller in the 19th century, the root of the English word religion, the Latin religio, was originally used to mean only reverence for God or the gods, careful pondering of divine things, piety, which Cicero further derived to mean diligence. Max Muller characterized many other cultures around the world, including Egypt, Persia, and India, as having a similar power structure at this point in history. What is called ancient religion today, they would have only called law. Some languages have words that can be translated as religion, but they may use them in a very different way, and some have no word for religion at all. For example, the Sanskrit word dharma, sometimes translated as religion, also means law. Throughout classical South Asia, The study of law consisted of concepts such as penance through piety and ceremonial as well as practical traditions. Medieval Japan at first had a similar union between imperial law and universal or Buddha law, but these later became independent sources of power. There is no precise equivalent of religion in Hebrew, and Judaism does not distinguish clearly between religious, national, racial, or ethnic identities. One of its central concepts is halakha, meaning the walk or path, sometimes translated as law, which guides religious practice and belief in many aspects of daily life. The Crusades against Muslim expansion in the 11th century was recognized as a holy war, or bellum sacrum, by later writers in the 17th century. The early modern wars against the Ottoman Empire were seen as a seamless continuation of this conflict by contemporaries. The term religious war was used to describe, controversially at the time, what are now known as the European Wars of Religion, and especially the then ongoing 7 Years' War, from at least the mid-18th century. In their Encyclopedia of Wars, authors Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod document 1763 notable wars in world history, out of which 121 wars are in the religious wars category in the index. They note that before the 17th century, much of the reasons for conflicts were explained through the lens of religion, and that after that time wars were explained through the lens of wars as a way to further sovereign interests. Some commentators have concluded that only 123 wars, 7%, out of these 1763 wars were fundamentally originated by religious motivations. The Encyclopedia of War, edited by Gordon Martell, using the criteria that the armed conflict must involve some overt religious action, concludes that 6% of the wars listed in their encyclopedia can be labeled religious wars. William T. Cavanaugh, in his Myth of Religious Violence, 2009, argues that what is termed religious wars is a largely Western dichotomy and a modern invention, arguing that all wars that are classed as religious have secular, economic or political ramifications. Similar opinions were expressed as early as the 1760s, during the 7 Years' War, widely recognized to be religious in motivation, noting that the warring factions were not necessarily split along confessional lines as much as along secular interests. It is evident that religion as one aspect of a people's cultural heritage may serve as a cultural marker or ideological rationalization for a conflict that has deeper ethnic and cultural differences. This has been specifically argued for the case of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, often portrayed as a religious conflict of a Catholic versus a Protestant faction, while the more fundamental cause of the conflict was in fact ethnic or nationalistic rather than religious in nature. Since the native Irish were mostly Catholic and the later British-sponsored immigrants were mainly Protestant, the terms become shorthand for the two cultures, but it is inaccurate to describe the conflict as a religious one. According to Irfan Omar and Michael Duffy's review of Violence and Peacemaking in World Religions, they note that studies of supposed cases of religious violence often conclude that violence is strongly driven by ethnic animosities. While early empires could be described as henotheistic, that is, dominated by a single god of the ruling elite, as Marduk in the Babylonian Empire, Ashur in the Assyrian Empire, etc., or more directly by deifying the ruler in an imperial cult, the concept of holy war enters a new phase with the development of monotheism. Classical antiquity had a pantheon with particular attributes and interest areas. Ares personified war. While he received occasional sacrifice from armies going to war, there was only a very limited cult of Ares. In Sparta, however, each company of youths sacrificed to an Helios before engaging in ritual fighting at the Phaeum. In early Christianity, St. Augustine's concept of just war, bellum justum, was widely accepted, but warfare was not regarded as a virtuous activity, and expressions of concern for the salvation of those who killed enemies in battle, regardless of the cause for which they fought, was common. According to historian Edward Peters, before the 11th century, Christians had not developed the concept of holy war, bellum sacrum, whereby fighting itself might be considered a penitential and spiritually meritorious act. During the 9th and 10th centuries, multiple invasions occurred which lead some regions to make their own armies to defend themselves, and this slowly led to the emergence of the Crusades, the concept of holy war, and terminology such as enemies of God in the 11th century. I would love to continue in my next episode. Kindly subscribe to my channel for more.